Sometimes a prison sentence is a harsh end to a promising career, but sometimes it's a pit stop on the path to redemption, which the stories of these celebrities who have actually killed people make plenty clear. In 1987, Matthew Broderick was still riding high in the success of Ferris Bueller's Day Off, which had come out the year before. At the time, he was dating Jennifer Grey, who played his sister in that film and was about to have her own star turn in Dirty Dancing. That August, Broderick and Grey were vacationing in Northern Ireland. They were driving along on a country road north of Belfast with Broderick at the wheel when tragedy struck. He drifted into an oncoming lane and struck a vehicle being driven by a 28-year-old named Anne Gallagher. She and her 63-year-old mother, Margaret Doherty, were killed, while Broderick was hospitalized with a broken leg, among other injuries. Broderick was also hit with the charge of death by reckless driving, and he faced up to a decade in prison. However, he was ultimately convicted of a much lesser charge of careless driving. Grey remained haunted by the incident decades later. As she admitted to Entertainment Tonight in 2022, "It's very hard to describe when you are present for the death of other people. It's just something that you just don't come back from in the same way." Amy Locane is probably best known for the 1990 John Waters movie Cry Baby and the first season of the classic primetime soap opera Melrose Place. But then in 2010, she made a terrible mistake that cost her not only her career, but also years of freedom. That June, she got behind the wheel while drunk, and she ended up crashing into the car of 60-year-old Helene Seaman, who was pulling into her driveway. Seaman was killed, and her husband was seriously injured. Locane blamed the accident on a third motorist, who she says distracted her by chasing and honking at her. But that didn't sit well with the sentencing judge at her trial. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison and was ultimately released in 2015. But in a shocking development, the prosecutor's office appealed her original sentence after her release, successfully arguing that it was too lenient. After years of legal wrangling, she was resentenced in 2020 to 8 more years. Brandy Norwood was one of the biggest names in R&B in the 1990s. She also found success as an actress, notably starring as the title character on the sitcom Moesha. But then in 2007, her career was nearly derailed by a terrifying crash on a California freeway. Brandy was behind the wheel of a Land Rover when she rear-ended a much smaller Honda while driving about 65 miles per hour. The Honda, driven by 38-year-old mother of two Awatefa Budahaj, struck another vehicle, smashed into a divider, and was finally struck by an oncoming vehicle. Budahaj later died in the hospital from injuries sustained in the crash. Police investigators recommended that Brandy be charged with vehicular manslaughter. But after prosecutors conducted their own investigation, they determined that there was insufficient evidence to merit any charges.
I did a lot of speaking to God, a lot of praying.
In the early 90s, up-and-coming actress Rebecca Gayheart was known as the Noxzema Girl, as she starred in a series of commercials for that line of facial care products. She would go on to a successful career in movies and TV, which included the classic teen drama Beverly Hills 90210 and the 1998 slasher Urban Legend. Unfortunately, in 2001, she also became known for accidentally taking another life. In June of that year, Gayheart was driving in Los Angeles when she encountered a traffic stoppage, which she swerved to get around. Unbeknownst to her, the cars had stopped to make way for a jaywalking child, 9-year-old George Cruz Jr., who was struck by Gayhart's vehicle. He died of his injuries the following day. Gayheart pleaded no contest to vehicular manslaughter. She was sentenced to probation, and her license was suspended for 1 year. She was also given a $2,800 fine and ordered to serve 750 hours of community service. Unsurprisingly, the accident changed her life forever. As she explained on the Only One in the Room podcast in 2019, "I just didn't want to live after that accident. That's what it came down to. I couldn't handle it at all. I still replay it in my head. Those things never go away. They stay with you forever." Don King is probably the most famous boxing promoter in history. But before the glamour of professional fisticuffs, he was involved with the much seedier world of illegal gambling. Back in the 1950s, King ran the biggest number racket in his hometown of Cleveland, Ohio. In 1954, he shot and killed a man who was attempting to rob one of his illegal gambling establishments, though he walked free when he successfully pleaded self-defense. But this wouldn't be the only time that he took a life. In 1966, King got into a heated argument with a man named Sam Garrett over money that King was owed. King severely beat Garrett, who later died in the hospital of his injuries. And this time, the deed didn't go unpunished. King was convicted of second-degree murder, though he served only a few years and began promoting fights soon after his release.
As to allegations that he tampered with justice, King denies the charges.
In 1983, King was actually pardoned for his crime. And in 2016, the Cleveland City Council briefly considered naming a stretch of Cedar Avenue after him. That was the very street where he killed Sam Garrett 5 decades earlier. The proposal was met with outcry in the press and was subsequently abandoned. Charles S. Dutton is a character actor who's beloved for his roles in movies like A Time to Kill and Menace to Society. He was also the lead of the sitcom Rock for 3 seasons, from 1991 to 1994. His love affair with acting began when he read the satirical play Day of Absence while he was in prison for manslaughter. The incident that led to Dutton's imprisonment happened when he was only 16 years old. In 1967, he found himself in a street fight with an older man, whom he ended up stabbing to death. Dutton was sentenced to 3 years behind bars, and while in prison, he got into a fight with a guard after being refused a visitor, which earned him an additional 8 years. Dutton confessed to simply enjoying fighting when he was younger, though he does sometimes lament the lost potential of the life he took. As he admitted to the Washington Post in 2000, "I never did anything to anyone who wouldn't have done the same to me. At first, I had no remorse, but then I used to wonder what the guy would look like if he was still living. Would he have amounted to something?"
In the solitude of their prison, he or she has to look in that mirror and say, you know what, I'm finished.
Retired basketball player Jayson Williams was one of the best rebounders in the NBA during the height of his career. After playing 11 seasons with the Philadelphia 76ers and New Jersey Nets, he was enjoying his retirement in 2002 when he was involved in a bizarre accident at his home. He and a group of guests had been shuttled from a Harlem Globetrotters game to a dinner at a restaurant, and then to Williams' estate by 55-year-old Kostas Christofi, a driver with a local limo company. At about 3 a.m., Williams was reportedly fooling around with one of his shotguns when he fatally shot Christofi in the chest. Prosecutors would later allege that Williams made numerous attempts to deflect blame from himself by imploring guests to lie about his whereabouts during the shooting and attempting to construct a narrative of suicide. In 2004, he was found guilty of attempting to cover up Christofi's death, but the jury deadlocked on reckless manslaughter charges, and a mistrial was declared. After years of legal wrangling, Williams pleaded guilty at a new trial to a downgraded manslaughter charge, and he was sentenced in 2010 to 5 years in state prison. Having served time at various points while awaiting legal proceedings, he was ultimately released in 2012.
There's not an hour that goes by that you don't think of that. I think about it all the time.
Caitlyn Jenner is no stranger to headlines, from her famous ex-wife and children to her transition as a transgender woman to her controversial politics. During the early days of her transition journey, she was in the news for a much more tragic reason: a car crash that claimed the life of a 69-year-old woman. In February 2015, Jenner's Cadillac Escalade was towing an off-road vehicle when it rear-ended a Lexus driven by Kim Howe on the Pacific Coast Highway. Howe's vehicle was propelled into oncoming traffic, where it was struck head-on by a Hummer, killing Howe instantly. Investigators determined that Jenner was driving unsafely, having swerved to avoid slowing traffic, but a district attorney's office investigation concluded that she hadn't been speeding or driving inattentively, and she ultimately wasn't charged with any crime. She did, however, settle with 5 parties who were injured in the accident, to the tune of $800,000. A separate lawsuit brought by Howe's stepchildren was likewise settled for an undisclosed amount.
Something like this, a tragedy like this, you'll never get over it. You just learn to live with it the best you possibly can.
Corey Miller burst onto the music scene in the mid-90s under the moniker C Murder. He enjoyed success with solo releases and as a member of the trio TRU, along with his brothers Master P and Silk the Shocker. In 2002, Miller was enjoying the high life when he was involved in an incident that lived up to his stage name in the most unfortunate way possible. That January, 16-year-old Steve Thomas was shot to death inside a New Orleans nightclub, and witnesses fingered Miller as the shooter. He was convicted of second-degree murder in 2003. But then he was granted a new trial in 2006 after a judge found that prosecutors had improperly withheld information about their star witnesses. That trial concluded in 2009, but the result was the same, as Miller's conviction was upheld, and he was ordered to spend the rest of his life in prison. However, the prosecution's witnesses eventually recanted their testimony of Miller as the shooter, but his sentence was still upheld by a federal judge in 2023. He's long maintained his innocence, and he's continued to release music while imprisoned. In 2017, all-time tennis great Venus Williams was navigating traffic in Palm Beach, Florida. As she attempted to get through an intersection, she was cut off by another vehicle. And that's where details of the ensuing accident get a little murky. What is known is that the crash ended with another car striking Williams' vehicle, and the passenger in that car, 78-year-old Jerome Barson, being taken to the hospital with serious injuries. He died 2 weeks later.
There are really no words to describe like how devastating and yeah.
In body cam footage taken immediately after the accident, a responding officer can be heard telling Williams that while it looked to him like she was at fault, he couldn't be completely sure and was therefore not issuing her a citation. The Palm Beach Police Department's investigation ultimately concluded that there was no basis for any charges to be filed. In 2018, Williams settled a wrongful death lawsuit brought by Barson's family for an undisclosed amount. Actor Johnny Lewis was probably best known as Kip Halfsack Epps on the FX motorcycle gang drama Sons of Anarchy. He also rode off-screen as well, and in 2011, he ended up in a scary crash. He wasn't diagnosed with serious head trauma, but according to those who knew him best, his behavior began to change after the accident. After the accident, Lewis became erratic and sometimes violent. He ran afoul of the law several times for fighting and spent time in jail and several rehab facilities for drug and alcohol problems. His steady downward spiral came to a shocking end in September 2012. After picking fights with several neighbors, he murdered his landlady, 81-year-old Catherine Davis. Davis's body was only discovered after Lewis himself met a bizarre end, which was ultimately ruled to be accidental. After killing Davis, Lewis apparently climbed onto the roof of her house, then tumbled into her driveway, suffering fatal injuries in the fall. Investigators initially blamed Lewis's behavior on drugs, but a post-mortem toxicology report revealed no substances in his system, leaving the motivations of the 28-year-old actor unknown. If you or anyone you know needs help with addiction issues, help is available. Visit the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration website or contact SAMHSA's National Helpline at 1-800-662-HELP. That's 1-800-662-4357.